Okay, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. We are just waiting for our guests to join us. So we are letting them in at the moment. I won't start until we have everybody. So just hang on for a few moments and then we will start the webinar. Okay, great. I guess people will join us as we continue. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. My name is Stephen Grusd, and I am the head of the African Governance and Diplomacy program here at the South African Institute of International Affairs, SIA, in Johannesburg. We have a wonderful, beautiful winter's day in Johannesburg, cold but sunny. So we get the best of both worlds. And I'm very delighted to be joined by Stephanie Walters. Stephanie is a research associate at the Institute. She has a lot of experience in the Great Lakes region. She was a journalist for many years. She also worked at the Institute for Security Studies, specializing in the Great Lakes, and is really an expert on DRC and the very complicated relations that it has with its neighbors. She's been studying the region for many years and has just returned from a trip to Chad. And if we have time and there's interest, we can talk about what's been happening in Chad. I'm not sure whether it always counts as Great Lakes, but Stephanie, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Hi, Steve. Thank you very much for having me today.
So we're going to kick off, and Stephanie will speak for about 15 or 20 minutes. Please be free to put your comments in the chat or your questions in the chat or the Q&A. I think if we can just stick to the chat, that's probably best. And we will have an engaging and interesting discussion. We are scheduled to go for an hour and a half, but we'll judge the interest of the audience. And Stephanie, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks again, Steve. And thanks to SIA for hosting this event today. I'm going to focus, as the event invitation says, very much on Eastern DRC and on the situation that we're finding ourselves in at the moment, looking at the military dynamics there and also looking at the political processes that have been in place for some time now to try and resolve that situation, and then taking sort of a look at some of the other external players and also at the specific state of relations between Rwanda and the DRC. Someone's saying we can't see Stephanie. Is that still the case, or should I just carry on, Steve?
I can see you.
Okay.
Now we can. Great.
All right. Now they can. All right. So yes, so I want to just start by kind of situating us a little bit, and I'm sure that many of the people who are listening today already know this, but I think it's always worth mentioning again. We're in the fourth year of this conflict now between the M23 and its Rwandan backers and the Congolese government. People displaced. This is a province in Eastern DRC, and 2.5 million people being displaced is a huge amount. We have ongoing fighting. We've had actually an upsurge in fighting over the last few months, really since the beginning of the year. And we now understand that M23 has been able to expand the territory that it holds by about 70% since the end of 2023. So a huge expansion of control by the M23 rebel group. I think from my perspective, we really need to understand that resolving this is an urgent matter, precisely because of the humanitarian situation, because so many people are living in IDP camps and refugee camps, and because this is an ongoing crisis that continues to destabilize towns, villages, and large areas in Eastern DRC. So that's just something I wanted to say at the very beginning. And partially because we haven't seen a lot of direction towards resolution, really at all, unfortunately, in the last year or so. So first, where are we with the military situation? I mean, I think that this is the term I agree it. So many different military forces that are present there, that are fighting one another, that are fighting in loose coalitions and so on. On the one side, we obviously have the M23 and the Rwandan Defense Forces who are backing the M23. And on the other side, we have the Congolese army, which has created a coalition with a group that calls itself the Wazalendo, which translates roughly as patriots, and which is really many of the armed groups that before the outbreak of the conflict between the M23 and the FARDC were also enemies of the FARDC, but who are now in coalition. They've been united by the common enemy of the M23. Now, this, I suppose, some people I think is useful. Clearly, the Congolese government thinks to help the FA, a highly under-resourced army, not a very effective force. That's been one of the chronic problems in Eastern DRC, and one of the reasons that Rwanda argues it has every right to go into the Congo. And so adding troops to that without necessarily increasing the resources or the efficacy of that coalition with the Wazalendo isn't necessarily going to improve the fighting capacity. There's overall a poor capability within that coalition. We have increasing numbers of human rights violations, and many of the members of the armed groups that have joined that coalition have already been sanctioned or in some way have been involved in human rights violations. And then we also have the concern specifically with the Wazalendo of vigilantism, a lack of central command going through to the FARDC. And finally, the question of what happens when this is all over. What kind of bargains will Kinshasa then have to strike with these former enemies, these armed groups who are now coming in very handy, but ultimately will potentially become a new problem down the line. We also know from various UN experts reports that the Congolese government at one point or another over many years, but specifically in this latest round of violence, has had a relationship with the FDLR, the Rwandan Hutu armed group. But since at the end of last year, we've seen the Congolese government change its tune quite considerably on that alliance. Kinshasa passed a law at the end of 2023, according to which any soldier who is considered to be cooperating or collaborating with the FDLR will be severely punished. That's obviously an important step. On the ground, it's a lot harder to get that to be functional, to get those relationships to end. But it's, I think, an important concession that was made by Kinshasa, and it was part of the confidence-building efforts that were undertaken by the United States government at the end of last year. So that is an important development, but it doesn't by any means mean that there are no more links between the FARDC and the FDLR. It also doesn't mean that Rwanda has pulled back on that argumentation. It hasn't. In addition to the FARDC Wazalendo coalition and the FDLR, who are still around and loosely on the Congolese government side, we have the bilateral deployment of Ugandan troops who are fighting jointly with the Congolese army in Operation Shuja against the ADF in the north. And then, of course, we also have Burundian troops who also are deployed to Eastern DRC under a bilateral agreement with the Kinshasa government, but who also have very much their own agenda in terms of their deployment as they are fighting rebel groups that are hostile to the Burundian government. We then also have mercenaries hired by Kinshasa, and of course that comes at a price tag for a country that doesn't have that many resources, and as I mentioned earlier, already faces resource constraints in how it supports the FARDC. And then finally, and this will be of interest to many because we're in South Africa, of course, we have the newly deployed SAMI DRC, who have been there since late 2023, replacing the East African Community Force. We now know that the SAMI DRC deployment has reached about 3,000 troops out of a total of 5,000. The number of 5,000 comes from SADC's own internal operational concept of operations. It's very difficult to get a full handle on many of the details about SAMI DRC because the troop contributing countries are not very forthcoming with that information. But we believe that full deployment is intended to be about 5,000. So we're 6 months into this deployment, and the force is still not fully deployed. We also have challenges with the in-kind contribution that was meant to come from the Congolese government, everything from field kitchens to air support and ration support. This was part of the deal that was made between Kinshasa and SADC. And then in terms of financing, what we know has been pledged now and paid to some extent is that South Africa has supported the SADC deployment with $100 million US, and the DRC has pledged $200 million, which, as I was told recently, 50 million of which have already been paid to SADC. And SADC is meant to be the administrative body that covers the admin side of SAMI DRC, which I should say is composed of South African troops, Tanzanians, and Malawians. So we've had SAMI DRC in that space now for 5 months. They've very much been targeted by the M23 since they first started deploying, even through heavy weaponry. There have been quite a lot of casualties already for the SAMI DRC force. In the last few months, as part of this territorial expansion of about 70%, many of the M23 have taken parts of the Petit Nord, north of Goma. And so even when SAMI DRC reaches full deployment and does start to act more aggressively against the M23, it's going to have its work cut out for it, because it's really going to be fighting an army, the M23 and the RDF, who have established themselves in those areas north of Sake and of Goma. So it'll be a real battle. This isn't going to be like it was in 2013, or 2012, 2013, when the FIB went in and faced a very weak M23. This is the exact opposite. This is a very, very strong M23 that's been able to really dig in. So recapturing will involve heavy fighting and likely a lot of casualties, which I think will have consequences in South Africa. We have a very different political landscape today than we had when this deployment was initially initiated. And I think that maybe with the government of national unity, we'll have more outspoken opposition, or at least commentary on South Africa taking heavy casualties in the DRC. I think there are other risks as well of SAMI DRC, which is that it could become or could be considered ineffective in its fight against the M23 precisely for the reasons I just mentioned, and then it gets bogged down and doesn't ever receive all the resources, especially financial resources, that it needs to fully succeed in its mission. And even if it does receive those resources, there's no guarantee whatsoever that SAMI DRC can impose a military defeat on the M23 and the RDF. On the positive side, I think it's important to mention that, as many of you will probably know, the East African Community Force fell out ultimately with the Congolese government in the first year of its deployment, and then withdrew at the end of 2023, essentially over a difference of opinions about whether or not it had a mandate to go aggressively after the M23, which ECRAFT argued it did not, and the Congolese government argued that it did. So SAMI DRC has already engaged in kinetic action with the M23. So it is not questioning whether its mandate is to go after the M23. It's very much engaged in that logic. So from a Congolese government perspective, SAMI DRC is the force with the mandate that it wants. So that is already a big difference to ECRAFT. I think there are many other overall risks to this hyper-militarization. I mean, so many forces running around in a small space, not all coordinated, not all really with the same kinds of objectives. But on a bigger level, we also have this over-reliance on a military option by the Kinshasa government, partially in pursuit of a military victory, but also clearly because it wants to try and gain some leverage as negotiations under the Luanda process loom. And so we have this sort of full investment in a military process, which so far hasn't really shown any benefits whatsoever, and in fact means that the war has dragged on and has become even more intense in the last 6 months. We also have quantity over quality. I think all the different, everything from mercenaries to a regional force to bilateral forces to armed groups that have been repurposed to be allies. I mean, this is a large number of elements to throw at a military problem, and again, I think means that we are likely to see this war dragging on for much, much longer. There's also, in my view, the real risk that Kinshasa feels that it's given a lot of attention and energy to this war, precisely by mobilizing all these different forces, and that it becomes politically somewhat disengaged as it becomes more interested in things like whether or not Tshisekedi can change the constitution. That's a new issue that has come up recently, but also trying to keep his ruling party together. We've seen it that's taken 6 months to come up with a government, 6 months after the elections, which seems inappropriate given how given that the country is essentially fully at war, and that its civilians are suffering. But it really tells us a lot about the extent to which there's just horse trading going on in Kinshasa, and that takes up a lot of time and a lot of space. So my worry is that may become a greater priority for Tshisekedi in this mandate than necessarily being committed to finding a political solution to what's going on in the East. I think all of those factors, the longer it takes to resolve this, the longer we have both short and long-term destabilization of the East. And how we resolve this acute crisis will really, in many ways, be decisive about what ends up happening in Eastern Congo in the long term. So those are some of the risks I wanted to point out regarding this hypermilitarization and this overemphasis, I would say, on a military solution, on a military process. We do have, of course, ever since the beginning of this conflict, other processes. One is the Nairobi process, which was intended to bring together Congolese groups to discuss the modalities of a disarmament process that had started in Eastern Congo in 2021. And which has more or less become defunct, both the disarmament process and the Nairobi process. Many of the groups that were participating in the Nairobi process, notably the ones obviously in North Kivu, but also South Kivu, have just gone back to the battlefield. And so it's a little bit out of step with their current mindset to be going and negotiating DDR. So I think we need to I think we certainly need to push the pause button on Nairobi and not try and invest any more resources in that, because it doesn't address the key problem that we have at the moment. And even though there are other groups from other parts of the East and Ituri and areas like that might want that process now, I'm not sure it's really the right timing. And it's definitely not the right process to try and address the M23 problem, because the M23 from pretty much the first day were kicked out of that process for violating the ceasefire on the ground. The more important process, I think, at the moment is clearly the Luanda process, which is being mediated by Angolan President João Lourenço, and that involves trying to get Tshisekedi and Kagame to speak to one another and to agree to a certain number of key steps: a ceasefire, withdrawal to positions by the M23, and so on and so forth. That has been in place, this particular process, since late 2022. And although there have been many meetings, both at presidential level and at the level of ministers of foreign affairs, it fundamentally hasn't moved the needle on the conflict. It's really not able to sustain a dialogue and get sort of a sequenced or get an agreement on a sequenced withdrawal and end of hostilities and withdrawal. There is going to be another Minister of Foreign Affairs meeting in the next few weeks. And I think that Angola is perfectly well placed to do this. I'm not suggesting that their mediation is the issue. I think the issue is that neither Kagame nor Tshisekedi have any incentive at this point to make concessions, to meet at the negotiation table where they would have to make those concessions. And so their interest in the political resolution right now is not where it should be if we want Luanda to succeed. And I think that one of the important things that the international community could do is try and exert some of its leverage on the different parties to get them to come to that negotiating table, because Luanda on its own doesn't have leverage over those two countries. I think, for example, one of the things that we've always said is that there need to be potentially sanctions on Rwanda, not on individuals, but on the state. And there needs to be more pressure on Tshisekedi also to speak with the M23. Both of those are very politically touchy. Tshisekedi doesn't want to speak to the M23 because he's said so many times now that that's not who the real enemy is. And I think politically it's risky and costly for him. And obviously, imposing sanctions on Rwanda is something that most international members, most international countries just don't want to do. Again and again, we've had these conversations with key actors, and really apart from I think the leaders on not so much sanctions, but just pushing Rwanda and being very clear with Rwanda are very much the Americans and the Belgians at this point. There's a lot less appetite amongst other countries to maintain some kind of sustained pressure on Rwanda to stop supporting the M23. So it's a difficult situation because we don't have a lot of champions out there who want to take on the difficult challenge of dealing with Kigali as well. So these confidence building measures, that's another political process that has been ongoing. The director of the National Intelligence Agency was in Rwanda and Kinshasa at the end of last year. And there have been follow-up initiatives since then. So the U.S. has really tried to, I think, put its money where its mouth is and try to be constructive about its engagement and moving the two parties towards some kind of sustained negotiation. And as I mentioned, in particular, the pressure on Kinshasa was to sever ties with the FDLR. I mean, it makes perfect sense anyway for Kinshasa to do that, because when it works closely with the FDLR, it gives Rwanda the precise pretext that it needs to get involved, and that despite the fact that actually the FDLR don't represent a significant or real threat to Rwanda and haven't done so for many, many years. But when Kinshasa chooses to align itself militarily with these guys, that immediately sets back Kinshasa's argument, and with they lose the moral high ground when they do that. So the fact that Kinshasa has taken some concrete steps to try and end that relationship between the FARDC and the FDLR is important, and that is to some extent a result of that pressure coming from the United States. So that's been useful, but it's certainly not enough to get more out of either party. Moving on to South Africa, obviously a big investment that South Africa has made, and Tanzania and Malawi, all of whom are also in the Force Intervention Brigade, in trying to come to the assistance of a member state. It's very difficult to get a handle on why South Africa has chosen to do this. It's had to withdraw essentially from Samim in Mozambique because there aren't the resources to sustain that deployment and to sustain the deployment in the DRC. So it's come at a cost already for South Africa and for SADC. And one could argue that Mozambique, or what's happening in Mozambique, is a closer threat to South Africa and to Tanzania for that matter. Interestingly, of course, it's also a space where they were working on the same side as Rwanda. Rwanda has troops bilaterally deployed to help Mozambique in its insurgency in the north. And in the field of DRC, we have the SADC forces opposed to Rwanda in the sense that Rwanda's actively supporting the M23. So these are all interesting factors. I think that one thing that's really missing from the South African approach that we would have liked to have seen is a greater engagement in a political solution. South Africa does have a special envoy. Minister Jeff Radebe was appointed last year, but we don't see a lot of activism coming from his office. The South African sort of preference is to engage with political issues using the Peace, Security, and Cooperation Framework, the Addis Ababa Accords, which were signed in 2013, which in my view are not enough to really change the current situation. So I think it would be useful if South Africa could get more politically engaged in trying to find a solution, a negotiated solution between the sides. Excuse me. As I said earlier, I think it's going to be increasingly difficult for South Africa to explain this major investment that it's made, because it's put so much money into this, but also South African lives. And certainly one of the things that we also wonder is what happens when the first year is over, who then takes over the bill? And I mean, there are options, I think, that are being discussed behind the scenes with regards to UN funding. I know that the EU is working on funding for SAMI DRC. So I think that ever since SAMI DRC received the endorsement of the United Nations and the endorsement also of the African Union Peace and Security Council, there are new channels of funding that can come in, but there's a lot of questions we still haven't seen answered on the longevity of that particular deployment. And speaking of the AU-PSC, there's also the African Union, moving on to the African Union, which has been politically very inactive on the Great Lakes conflict, on the situation in Eastern DRC. Aside from being the sort of venue for a number of different regionally led summits at the AU summit earlier this year, there's been no political leadership really coming from the African Union. João Lourenço is mediating in his capacity as an AU special envoy on peace, I think is the official title. But really, beyond that, there's no real support being given to a political solution by the African Union in an active way. And even the AU-PSC's meeting on Sami DRC that was held in February, at which the AU essentially endorsed Sami DRC, really came about because Namibia had the presidency of the AU-PSC that month. So that was a fortuitous thing for a SADC member state to be able to put that on the agenda, but it did not come from the commission itself. To maybe move on, and this will be sort of my last my last bit, to where Rwanda and the DRC are now. As I said earlier, the DRC is staying firm on its refusal to negotiate with the M23. In many ways, that's almost self-defeating. We know why this is the case. There's been an incredible surge in Rwanda anti-Rwanda horrible things that have become more of a reality in the DRC in the last 4 years. And so it is politically risky for Tshisekedi to say that he'll engage with these rebels directly. Because the prevailing view in Congo is that, and the fact is that these are Rwandan-backed rebels. But speaking to the M23 has a number of different advantages. Obviously, if you're trying to find peace, you have to explore all avenues. But also, in some ways, it diffuses this argument, that Rwanda isn't involved. If you really are speaking with the interlocutor, and if it really is the M23, then technically, once you've found some kind of common ground with them, the situation should change. And I think it has the potential to expose the Rwandan role in a more obvious way, although I would argue that we don't really need more of that because we've had so many UN reports that show very clearly that the Rwandans are very actively involved. And so in my view, that element is certainly no longer in question. But nonetheless, I think that from a tactical perspective, it would be useful for Tshisekedi to try that strategy. We're not anywhere near that, unfortunately, from what I'm told. I think Kinshasa is not interested in that. Again, I mentioned that I fear that the politicians in Kinshasa will be more focused on politics in Kinshasa over the next few years. Especially if we do get that constitutional review to allow Tshisekedi to stay in office. And certainly he's going to have a lot of work cut out for him, keeping his Union Sacrée together. And we can talk about the coup and the question and answer period and what that tells us a little bit maybe as well. But as I said, they've made efforts on the FDLR, and that is coming some way towards meeting some of the concerns of Rwanda, but they're still very much a pro-war rhetoric. We saw this week the new defense minister kind of taking over from Jean-Pierre Bemba and putting on social media, we're all geared up for war with Rwanda. These are coming from a minister of defense. That's strong rhetoric. On the other side, we have a similarly committed stance, if I can put it that way. Rwanda, if anything, I think has become more defensive over the last year. It's very, very opposed to Sami DRC and appears to consider it to be an escalation of the situation, which is ironic for many reasons. One, that it denies that it's involved, and two, also because the reality is that the DRC asked a REC of which it is a member to deploy a military force to its country, and so it has every right to do that as a sovereign nation. But despite that, Rwanda has strenuously opposed Sami DRC, writing letters to the UN Security Council and the African Union Peace and Security Council, stating very clearly that it feels that this is a threat and is uncalled for. It's gone even further and actively accused South Africa of supporting a Congolese, a Tutsi genocide. This is another element that has been added to sort of the Rwandan rhetoric about Congo. In addition to the FDLR problem, Kagame now argues that the Congolese Tutsi community is under grave threat, and that there have already been killings that have taken place, although there is no evidence of that. There is a bigger picture problem with regards to nationality and so on, but what Kigali is putting out there at the moment is very much just rhetoric. So Rwanda doesn't seem ready at this point to be to go to the negotiating table, and I mean we won't know until they are, because that's not their style in any case. But on the other hand, it did lose two big diplomatic offensives, one at the UN and one at the AU, and Rwanda's not used to losing when it's usually strategically so skilled that it wins the battles that it starts on a diplomatic front, and so a rare defeat for it with the AU and the UN. And I think it's also feeling a little bit more regionally isolated, partially because we have Burundi, with whom it's got very bad relations. Burundi accuses Rwanda of backing rebels hostile to its government. Tanzania chose not to participate in the East African Community Force, but on the other hand is choosing to participate in Sami DRC. Those are two immediate neighbors. Uganda, it's an interesting relationship, and we can maybe talk more about it in the question and answer, but for now remains an important Rwandan ally. But one of the things that triggered the M23 resurgence is the fact that Uganda had closer relations, that Kigali felt threatened by, closer relations with Kinshasa. A bilateral military operation was agreed, the Shuja operation, a road construction project going down into an area which Rwanda considers to be sort of its turf. And so that rivalry with Uganda is one of the reasons we see this conflict now. And so that's always something to keep in mind, that there's that on-off, that relationship with Uganda. On the other hand, we have substantially greater support for Rwanda coming from Kenya. Once Ruto came into office, things very much changed. Uhuru Kenyatta had been very close to Tshisekedi. Ruto has said many times again that this is a Congolese problem, and certainly isn't seeing this differently. So, but like Tshisekedi, Kagame has kind of talked himself into a corner on this one. So it's difficult to see what kinds of concessions he would be willing to make publicly, because they very much feed into the myth of Kagame himself, the kinds of the belligerence of the response to what's happening in Eastern DRC. And then I think finally, and this is something again that hopefully we can talk about, it's not entirely clear what is the end game. When does the M23, when does Rwanda think it's got what it wants in Eastern DRC? And I think in many ways, if we harken back to the Kabila days, that's when Kagame had what he wanted. He had more or less open access or unfettered access to Eastern Congo, and that has changed under Tshisekedi. It's gone up and down, but anyway, that's certainly one of the key elements that has changed. So how do you resolve that is a question. So I think I'll leave it there, and then hopefully there's lots to talk about in the next hour or so. Thank you very much, Steve.
Great, thanks so much, Stephanie. I mean, your depth of understanding this conundrum, this complicated mess, always impresses me. So thank you. I mean, we've got a few questions coming in, and I will definitely get to them. I just have a few of my own. I mean, one reflection is, I'll age myself here, but I was studying my master's in London in 1996, 1997, which was the fall of Mobutu and the Kabila father taking over. I mean, it just seems like we have not really moved in 30 years on this conflict. It's not on our screens as well. We have a lot of Gaza conflict and Ukraine, but the major networks are not covering this. You keep a very close eye on it, but it's not in the consciousness. Is this just a case of a country that's too big to control, that has lots of goodies on the east, and a very, very complicated dynamic?
Well, I wouldn't say it's too big to control. I mean, I know that people often say that, and of course it's huge, and it's certainly a lot bigger than Rwanda, Burundi, or Uganda. But I would argue that nobody's really tried to control it. And of course, that's one of the issues, is that governance, the extension of services and tangible governance to citizens, and even the creation of of a good army that can maintain the country's borders and that doesn't prey on its own civilians. I mean, those are major governance failures that certainly contribute to 30 years of a cycles of violence. But I think that, there are other interests that have come into play, and that certainly started coming into play already in that very first war, which was driven to a great extent by Rwanda's desire to basically, first break up the refugee camps where the Interahamwe had reconstituted themselves. And that then went further. They fell out with Laurent Kabila father, because Laurent Kabila father made the big mistake of choosing to work with the FDLR as he was trying to sort of emancipate himself. And that has led to, many of the dynamics that we still see today. Obviously, the economic issue is a major one. Both Uganda and Rwanda are huge exporters of gold, which they don't have on their territory. So in other words, what's happening is that they're exporting gold that's smuggled out of the DRC into their countries, and reaping the benefits from it. I think also the truth is that we've underestimated the regional elements of this war. We've always considered that the Eastern DRC is such a basket case, and that Congo is such a basket case. That's what's creating the problem. It's an element. I think there's no question, as I said earlier. But the drivers that are coming from the outside are just as much part of this cycle of violence. And the reality is also that Uganda and Rwanda, and to some extent Burundi, haven't felt the consequences of the negative consequences of this constant interference in the Eastern Congo, whether it be in the economic sphere or the security sphere. They've benefited, but they've not borne the consequences, the negative consequences. Those have been borne to a great extent by Congolese civilians, and in particular in this conflict. And I think it's an important thing to keep in mind, because often at Rwanda, of course, always its rhetoric is about the FDLR, but no Rwandans have been killed by the FDLR in the last 20 years, and we've lost hundreds of thousands of people in Eastern DRC. So, I think, but it's not, in my view, insurmountable. I just think we have to make the effort. And I mean, as you say, it competes with a lot of other major crises. It's complicated to understand. And what's unfortunate at the moment is that we're not seeing a lot of coverage of the humanitarian consequences of this war. A lot of people, I think, because like you say, many of the dynamics are similar to what they've been over the years. And so if you're a journalist, it might be difficult to find a new angle or to, whatever. But the reality is that the humanitarian consequences this time are dramatically worse. And that should be one of our focuses.
You didn't, unless I missed it, mention IGAD. What role does that regional organization play, if any, in trying to resolve this?
Yeah, IGAD isn't really concerned by this because it's not a core Great Lakes country. And so actually, until the DRC joined the East African Community, there was no one REC that had the four core Great Lakes countries as members, and the four core Great Lakes are Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and DRC. So EAC is a first. What we did have, and what we still have, is the International Conference on the Great Lakes Region, which was actually set up in 2006 partially to be a vehicle for regional peace, but which has always been weaker than its member states and was quite easily dominated by the agendas of Rwanda and Uganda, and so has never been the forum, I think, for real conflict resolution when it comes to DRC, Rwanda, and Burundi, and Uganda, unfortunately.
And talk to us a little bit about the coup, or the attempted coup, that happened a couple of weeks or months ago.
Yeah, well, it's frustrating for Congo watchers is that of course got a huge amount of attention. I mean, how could it not? Because of how it was done. I mean, at the moment, look, we're all still working on theories. I haven't seen any great factual reports on this, but we saw about 40 armed guys sort of early in the morning on a Sunday attacking the residence, first of the prime minister, but then moving relatively quickly on to the residence of the vice prime minister of the economy, a man named Vital Kamerhe, who's probably, who's a political chameleon is an understatement. He's worked with everybody over the years and is now in an alliance with Tshisekedi, and was running. And he now won for the president of National Assembly, which is a powerful position if you're trying to get your legislative agenda crossed, or for that matter, if you're trying to change a constitution. And so they went from his house, but there was about an hour's firefight around his house. And then they moved on to the presidential office. And so one of the big questions is, how did they manage to do this in the middle of the night and sustain this kind of heavy fighting? Well, it wasn't heavy weapons, but fighting nonetheless, without a response from other security services. And you have to understand, this isn't a part of Kinshasa where there are lots of embassies. A lot of government ministers are living there, so the security presence is usually quite high. And meanwhile, these guys managed to for about 2 hours to kind of have their way with that area without anybody stopping them. And so that has got alarm bells ringing. Were the security forces told not to go in? I mean, what happened here? And then the focus on Vital Kamerhe's house has sort of sparked a lot of theories that it was an internal kind of palace intrigue situation where potentially people around Tshisekedi were wanting to get rid of Vital Kamerhe because they know that he'll be difficult if there is, he can be difficult when it comes to kind of controlling him and convincing him to remain an ally to Tshisekedi politically. And they have a bit of a history there as well between the two of them. And then finally, I think the other thing is that, even if the 40 guys who were involved in this were acting independently and had the intention of trying to overthrow a government, I mean, there are other areas that you attack. Most often it's the national broadcaster or the president's actual residence. And also with 40 men, how could you even think that this was going to be successful? And so all of that has kind of contributed to this idea that it was something that was potentially staged, managed, to get rid of Vital Kamerhe, and so on. And then I think for us now, the concern is that there a lot of people have been, obviously some of the coup leader was shot, and then a lot of other people have been dragged into this. There's a Belgian, also political analyst, Belgian Congolese, who's been arrested, Jean-Jacques Wando. There are others who've been arrested, and so the next concern is, who gets sort of raked over the coals for this, and are they really the ones responsible? And can we have some transparency in that process as well? So there's concerns that there'll be human rights violations going after people who are either going to be made to look like they were involved or were actually involved. And so, yeah.
Okay, great. I'm going to get to the questions in a minute because they're starting to come in, which is really great. I wanted to ask you, is South Africa not setting itself up for failure? We have an aging army. I think we've got one of the oldest average age forces in the world. We don't have the equipment, despite our very famous arms deal. We don't have the right gear for really tackling the sort of problems that we set ourselves up to. So is South Africa setting itself up for failure? There was also a question here, which I'll link to this, from Toke Arnoldi. Could be interesting to hear more on the change in the South African political landscape and how it could affect the SAMI DRC mission. Are there any parties directly opposing the mission?
Okay, sure. I mean, look, I think South Africa, I mean, I'm not a specialist on the South African army. We've seen a lot of people criticize this deployment, saying that what you say, the equipment is old, they haven't been properly trained. I think we know that there are concerns with the South African army. I mean, if it can't sustain kind of SAMIM in Mozambique and SAMI DRC, we already know that there are limitations there. And obviously, the equipment limitations as well. I think that if we look I mean, one of the things that tells us a lot is where I know more about how South Africa can perform than necessarily about its capacity as an army is the environment that they're walking into, which, the FIB has been there for, 11 years now. And if you look at the Force Intervention Brigade, which is composed of South Africa, Tanzania, and Malawi, they also had an offensive mandate against different groups. And when they did their internal evaluations, one of their big concerns or complaints was that they didn't have access to sufficient intelligence. Meanwhile, with the FIB, they're actually associated with the UN, and I would argue are better informed or had better access to intelligence than they would if they're just operating on their own. And even with that, they weren't able really to make a substantial difference on the ground. I mean, one of the criticisms of the FIB is that after it defeated the M23, and it was a weak M23, as I said, because Rwanda had withdrawn its support, they haven't really made a difference on the battleground, and neither has MONUSCO. And so they haven't really succeeded in neutralizing some of these armed groups that they set out to neutralize. So I think that those same concerns about contextual understanding, how do all these different groups work together, is a concern for me, how well South Africa is informed about a lot of that. So military intelligence and how much of the component of their deployment includes military intelligence, contextual understanding, knowing who they're shooting at because there's so many different actors now, knowing the terrain. And the fact that, this, as I said earlier, is going to be a lot bloodier than 2012 and 2013 were. And so I think South Africa is in for, I do wonder, I mean, I've asked myself this question, did South Africa underestimate what it was getting itself into? And when you read their sort of, again, the concept of operations and the various SADC documents, I mean, their interpretation of this conflict is Asa, and they speak very clearly about Rwanda's role and so on and so forth. And I think they see things quite lucidly, but I wonder to what extent they understand the nuances. And I wonder to what extent they understand the determination of Kagame. And Kagame has taken this very personally. I mean, he gave an interview to the SABC in early April, where he was highly critical of South Africa's deployment to Eastern DRC. And I think we've seen very clearly that the M23 are targeting South African and Sami DRC soldiers. So it's a very, very risky business, even if you're as well prepared as you can be.
So that's the first thing about the elections in South Africa and whether there are any parties that would be actively against the deployment.
Sure. I'm almost certain, but correct me if I'm wrong, that the DA is not on board with the Sami DRC deployment. It's not something that went through Parliament, didn't have to, but still, there have been lots of commentary. And so I think that they would have a very big issue. I mean, I know the DA shadow defense minister, I think, has had a lot to say about that deployment and about specifically the issue that you raised, that the soldiers just aren't ready. And so we're sending South African troops into the line of fire without them having the means to defend themselves. And I think that is something that they will continue to push. I mean, they have other foreign policy disagreements, obviously, that are bigger than that over Israel and Gaza, notably. But certainly if the DA were to be part of the government of national unity, I would imagine they would raise that. Do I think that it means that they will withdraw? I mean, it's hard to say at this point. I mean, that obviously also depends on how the whole thing plays out and on Parliament and so on and so forth, and what kinds of alliances will be formed. But I think that it's a harder time to do this than it has been in the past. And I've always been surprised at how little the South African public is interested in SANDF deployments abroad and even in SANDF casualties abroad. It barely makes the headlines. And I think that might be different this time around. So it is, I won't say quagmire, but it has potential.
My last burning question before we get to the other questions is, who pays for all this? How do all of these groups sustain themselves?
You mean all the different Congolese armed groups?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, mostly, to be honest, through informal taxation, roadblocks along, paths and roads and in Eastern DRC. So taxing civilians, on a day-to-day basis, 100 francs here, 200 francs there. A lot of them are involved in the smuggling of natural resources. Some of the armed groups control mines and so are actively involved in the mining. I want to be clear that the conflict is not primarily about who controls the minerals, but the fact that the minerals are there is a source of revenue that sustains armed conflict. And so there are quite a few different ways in which the armed groups are able to kind of sustain themselves. And you have to remember, I mean, these are, I wouldn't say ragtag, but these aren't, the M23 is probably, well, not probably, is the most well-constituted rebel group. And that's because of Rwandan support. It's the most well-resourced rebel group in the East at the moment. The other rebel groups that are running around are not nearly that well-resourced and that well-organized. But they basically are living off of an illicit economy that they've created and that they sustain in order to remain active. And then, of course, there's also a lot of leakage of Congolese armed weaponry. And so there's that and of other rebel groups kind of, weaponry. But yeah, that's basically.
Okay. All right, let's get on to the questions from the audience. Nirvali Mulu asks, what drives the DRC's partnership diversification strategy in terms of international partnerships And how does it affect national and regional stability? Are we seeing the DRC assert its sovereignty, if it has any? And what would the long-term implications of this be?
Okay. I want to make sure I understand that. So are you, I guess what we're talking about is what makes Congo choose the allies it has, I guess
That's
in
how
the
I interpret it, and also its relations with the donor community, which is part of
yeah.
that same equation.
Okay. Okay, donor community. All right. Okay, well, in terms of how it's kind of, I mean, maybe I should start with the East African community. So a very, very long time, the East African community was keen to have Congo be a member. And remember that Congo, I mean, it could be a member of many, many, and it is a member of many different regional economic communities. Has so many neighbors. It has 9 neighboring countries. Member of East African community. For a long time, it wasn't, because under Kabila they felt that perhaps that was premature. But the entire Eastern DRC already trades very, very heavily with Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi. So expanding it to include, other countries in the East African community made a lot of economic sense. Also, but this was a first for DRC to to pivot to its east. So in other words, to pivot to the East African community. And that to a great extent was driven by this very close relationship between Uhuru Kenyatta and Tshisekedi that went back even to Tshisekedi's father. And Uhuru Kenyatta was involved in a whole number of different elements in the political process before the 2018 elections and then also after the 2018 elections. And Kenya saw and continues to see a great economic opportunities in the in the DRC as a whole. And so that's what drove that relationship. And Kenya's what drove the fast track membership of the DRC into the East African community. And at the time, Congo was much less active with regards to its SADC allies. So Angola is a different story because Angola is also a huge neighbor, and Angola and Congo always have to have good relations. But South Africa, for example, for those first few years, wasn't sort of a privileged partner of the DRC's. There was no state visit, and there wasn't a lot of exchange between those two countries. And so when Tshisekedi kind of started falling out with the East African community, and that falling out was triggered to some extent by the fact that the East African community wasn't willing to say to Rwanda, you've got to stop supporting the M23, coupled with this disagreement over what kind of a mandate the force had, DRC suddenly pivoted back to South Africa and to Southern Africa and to SADC. And much to many people's surprise, SADC immediately came to the party after having been really ignored for quite a few years, and is now again, as I mentioned, a very close ally of Tshisekedi's. And so, in many ways, under Tshisekedi, I can only say that it's been largely opportunistic. He's been looking for military allies who will help him fight the M23. Obviously, economic factors have some importance, but I think clearly here it's been about trying to find allies who will put boots on the ground. In terms of the relationship that Tshisekedi's government has with international actors, in the very early days when he came to office, and remember that he became president after a very contested election in a political agreement that was struck between Kabila and Tshisekedi, a lot of countries were, accepted the outcome, but were a bit circumspect about what it meant, and kind of had said to themselves, in terms of their own foreign policy, we're going to wait and see a little while if there are any sort of tangible improvements in human rights issues and freedom of speech issues and anti-corruption drives and so on in the first sort of year of Tshisekedi being in office. The one country that went all in very early on was the United States, and to some extent Belgium, which of course is a former colonial power. And so those two countries really led the way in terms of welcoming Tshisekedi and kind of throwing open the door and not really imposing any particular conditions or creating expectations, which made it a lot harder for other countries like EU countries and others to be a little bit more demanding. Today, I mean, as I said, sort of those who are quite willing to, or the ones that are more aggressive about trying to find or about condemning Rwanda's support to the M23 are Belgium and the US. Others simply aren't. I mean, France is a close ally of Rwanda's. The UK has its asylum policy. Um, getting sort of consensus in the EU is hard precisely because of France. Please excuse me. And so it's harder to get that coalition together to kind of support Tshisekedi's view on the war. But those countries all remain very active players in the development space in the DRC. I hope I answered that question.
Great. Caroline Hellier says, "Ghosts from the past, question mark. Nkunda, I saw him in Rutshuru in 2013. What about now? Is he even alive? It's like there's an omerta about him. Can you explain who he is?"
Yeah, Laurent Nkunda was the founder of the M23's predecessor. He is a general in the Congolese, sorry, in the during the Second Congo War, which was 98 to 2003, there was the Rally for Congolese Democracy, which was the Rwandan-backed rebel group. And Laurent Nkunda was part of that group. And when the war ended, he was invited to become a general in the Unified Congolese Army, and he refused. And he is a Tutsi and is somebody who then formed the first sort of Tutsi-led military challenge in the East, taking Bukavu, and then over the years formed the CNDP, and then was kind of thrown under the bus by the Rwandans, and someone named Bosco Ntaganda, who's now at The Hague, took over the leadership of the CNDP, and the CNDP would ultimately become the M23. I mean, with structural changes and also changes in composition, but fundamentally the same movement. And Laurent Nkunda in 2009 was sort of taken out of the picture. I'm not sure where he is. He's allegedly under house arrest in Kigali. But I have heard people say that he's quite happily, freely walking around. He did have a lot of following, and when he was eliminated or when he was removed from the role, it did cause a lot of friction within the CNDP. And there are still people within the M23 who, have become more sort of there are sort of splits that went Uganda, Rwanda, and that those kinds of initial splits started when Nkunda was removed. Where he is now, I like I said, he's in somewhere in Rwanda, but he's not active at the moment.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Peter Fabricius asks, "Hi, Stephanie. You mentioned that DRC could gain moral high ground by ending its collaboration with FDLR. Could it do that also by accepting M23 grievances at face value? And if so, are there any real grievances, such as integration into the FARDC? Thank you."
That's a good question, Peter. I think that there are some grievances that have to be, and let me separate maybe the M23 grievances left over from 2012 from the other grievances that they purport to have in the name of the wider Tutsi community, because they're sort of two different things. But so when one of the agreements in 2013 was not a blanket amnesty, but on a case-by-case basis, some of the combatants would be either DDR'd or would join the Congolese army, and that DDR process just never ended. It never started properly. It never came to fruition, and there were still many combatants who remained in refugee camps in Uganda and in Rwanda. And there are a number of reasons for that, and some of them have to do with the fact that some combatants and their leaders didn't want to be reabsorbed into the Congolese army, didn't want to fully give up the battle, and not so much because they continued to fight on the ground, but because they knew that they had powerful patrons who might need them again, and those powerful patrons are Uganda and Rwanda. So there were some disincentives to being part of the DDR process. And then on the other side, the Congolese side, there was just an inefficient process, stop, start, that eventually just fizzled out. And there are other people who know more about the exact details of that. Many different players tried to help with that DDR process, and it was picked up again by Tshisekedi in 2020 and had apparently gone some way towards a deal. And so I think that is a point of discussion that has to, be resolved at some point. It's going to be very, very difficult because for some time now, the Congolese government has had a policy of DDR doesn't mean amnesty, so it doesn't mean reintegration into the army. And the new DDR process, the PCDDRCS that we have now, which is unfortunately largely stuck, that's the prerequisite, is that there's no chance that you will be absorbed into the Congolese army. And over the years, one of the big cleavages that was created by past processes is that the CNDP, so Laurent Nkunda's guys, on at least 2 or 3 occasions, in order to end the conflict with them, they were appeased by being being handed integration into the Congolese army, but on their own terms. And so they integrated as fully intact units, which had their own command and control and so forth. And that created this is starting in 2006, 2009, 2013, and sorry, 2009, 2011, and that created a lot of friction with other actors in the army. And so to try and do that now is going to be very, very, very difficult, because it's going to create more resentment. And I think that today you have much greater attention being paid to that group than you had in those years. And so there's also a popular issue of dealing with that. The bigger picture issues, so I hope I answered that question, about getting the combatants back and disarming them, and under the modalities of that haven't been fully concluded, or never were. And I think those are reasonable, I mean, not reasonable, but those are grievances that the CNDP, that the M23 have put on the table again. The grievances around the Congolese Tutsi community are also real to some, many of them are also real. But I think that a lot of people question whether or not the M23 is the right vehicle to push for those. A lot of Congolese Tutsi have disassociated themselves from the M23 and also their predecessors, because often when these proxy groups emerge and speak for the community, it actually puts the community in greater danger, because there's so much resentment in the community, in the wider Congolese community, and because everybody always feels, and it's always often, it's usually the case, that they're actually acting on Kigali's behalf and not on behalf of the Congolese Tutsi community. So that's the complication with having the M23 create the agenda for some of the bigger picture issues that do need to take place, or do need to be addressed, about land ownership, nationality, and so on and so forth around the Congolese Tutsi community. And in any case, I think that isn't, I mean, I think it would be very difficult for that to be the center of the negotiation between the M23 and Tshisekedi, and for him to move on that. And I wonder to what extent the M23 would really push that if they were to sit down at the negotiation table, because I think if they got there, they would either be getting there with instructions from Kigali to push for certain things, and then in many ways, Kinshasa couldn't really make those concessions, or they would be there because they've understood, and this is an element that I think is something one needs to explore, that Kigali is using them, and that actually they're not going to have much of they're not very, their future isn't very sustainable if they always remain a proxy for Kigali. So it's a bit complicated, and I don't know if I've answered your question, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this is a very difficult onion to peel, because there are more and more layers, as one goes down. Okay, the next question comes from Peter Olison, and he says, natural resources are often mentioned in connection with this conflict, and some even reduce it to being mainly about access to profitable minerals. What's your take on this? Is Rwanda just protecting its access to resources? And then he says, Rwanda has 135,000 refugees, of which the majority are from the DRC. So there have been serious consequences for Rwanda of the Eastern DRC situation.
Okay.
The minerals and consequences.
Sure. Okay. Minerals. So, I mean, the whole mineral thing really started during the Second War. I think Rwanda and Uganda had already understood during the First War being the one to overthrow Mobutu, that there was a lot of wealth, mineral wealth, that was worth accessing in Eastern Congo. And during the Second War, both Rwanda and Uganda were really actively involved in mining. There was the coltan boom. There are a lot of other minerals in the Eastern DRC that they were actively involved in mining. over the years, that dynamic has quite substantially shifted. So you don't have the M23 up until they took the mine of Rubaya in I think March this year, weren't controlling any mining areas of massive consequence. Now they, and I won't get into Rubaya now because it's just too much too complicated. But today, what's really happening is that Rwanda and Uganda are benefiting from Congolese minerals that are being smuggled out. And they're being smuggled out by networks that have been established in the intervening 20 years, right? So since the war ended in 2003, those networks of regional business people, of armed groups, of the Congolese army, of the UPDF, of the RDF to some extent, have grown into an ecosystem that knows how to benefit from illicit minerals in Eastern Congo. So it's not mainly about that. I don't even think for Rwanda. And I'll explain why. So today, both Rwanda and Uganda make something like $1.5 billion a year from just Congolese gold. And then there's coltan and there are all sorts of other minerals that they're also net exporters of, but that they don't have on their territory. This stuff is brought over to their side, and they're involved obviously in financing and in the whole chain of extraction, and benefit from it. But the disincentive to necessarily sell that in Congo is also a Congolese issue, because well, first of all, I mean, those markets are right next door, but also there's a taxation law that means that actually selling gold within Congo is heavily taxed, and so there's an incentive to smuggle it to Rwanda and Uganda. But there's no question that those countries have become completely dependent for their GDP on these massive gold flows. So. But Rwanda doesn't need to be in an all-out war or prop up a proxy group in order to benefit. So the M23 conflict wasn't about gold. It wasn't, because there was no disruption to the gold supply going to Rwanda or to Uganda. The gold that they were mining or the gold that was flowing out continued to flow out while Rwanda had no presence. This was triggered by a rivalry in the region and Rwanda's desire to be able to control North Kivu for other reasons. And the sense that it has a right to that control and that it can assert that control. And the economic aspects weren't under threat at that point in any particularly acute way. And so that wasn't a trigger of this particular violence. And I hope that that's an explanation that draws a distinction between, yes, there are huge economic interests and they're it's a smuggling operation, it's an illicit economic activity, but that's not necessarily what drove Rwanda to pick up, to decide to re-engage in a conflict. That isn't necessary for the other to thrive, is what I'm trying to say. And quite frankly, I mean, just to add to that, there is this deal that the Congolese government made with a group called Primera out of the United Arab Emirates. And what they've done with them is that and the United Arab Emirates, by the way, is the end destination of most of the Rwandan and the Ugandan gold. So they're, one way or another, the gold makes its way over there. And that's an area that one should look at. Why is the UAE able to buy this gold, which essentially is smuggled along the way? And there's no way, it's certainly not certified. And there are a lot of tracing mechanisms that are in place that haven't necessarily worked. And that's partially because, a lot of Congolese actors who are involved in those certification schemes are also, prone to corruption and so on and so forth. And it's just a very difficult thing to impose. But to go back to the Primera deal, this is a de facto gold export deal because because you have to export a certain amount of gold per year in order to have an export permit. And so it disqualifies a lot of the smaller scale gold exporters and gold producers. And a lot of that is artisanal. In the East, we're talking about largely artisanally mined. So small scale miners who then, there's a whole chain of négociants, traders, and so on. And that was supposed to be that was the Congolese government billed that as a kind of one way to take back the control over the gold trade, and it just hasn't worked. for a whole variety of reasons. But again, the inability to just kind of control these things and to break up this very well entrenched network of interests and players. But if that were to work, that would be a major cause of friction with the Eastern DRC. And then one other thing I wanted to say, because we don't talk about it a lot, is that aside from the fact that there's all this gold that Rwanda and Uganda benefit from, Congo is the biggest export market for Rwanda. Many agricultural products that are consumed in Eastern DRC come from Rwanda. Eastern DRC for many years was economically, I mean, it was agriculturally self-sufficient. It's an incredibly fertile area of land. But because of the constant displacement over the last 25 years, a lot of that farming has ended, has died. And the beneficiary of that has been the Rwandan agricultural sector. And so there are other economic interests that Rwanda has in the Congo that go not just to the bottom line of GDP, but that actually employ Rwandans who work as, who have farms, who are agricultural workers. And so that's also an incredibly important element in that relationship. And we never talk about it. And you can ask, why doesn't Congo close the border and suffocate Rwanda's export capacity? And the answer is that, it would kill its own population in Eastern Congo, or not kill, but it would cause great harm to its own population in doing so. But, the incentives for peace are also there. We just have to kind of dig them out from the bigger picture.
So if I made you UN Secretary General for the week and I said, solve this, would you have any ideas of what to do?
No, thank you for asking that question.
Okay, let's move on to more serious ones. But you're welcome.
No, but I do have an answer to that.
Okay, great.
Sorry, I personally believe that our approach to this isn't correct. I mean, we need to start seeing it as a regional war. We need to start treating it as a regional war, which means we have to have the main actors of those countries involved in a peace process. I really feel like even if Luanda succeeds, it's a momentary element. But we haven't addressed the drivers of this. Burundi's in Congo pursuing its rebels. Uganda's pursuing its rebels. The Rwanda-Uganda rivalry triggered, an all-out conflict in Eastern Congo. There's nothing about this that isn't regional. Every country has its set of drivers and realities that contribute to this situation. And if we continually ignore that, we're not going to fix it. And so I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I think we have to start by speaking about it that way, because what's happening in the East is quite frankly, I mean, people don't like to use these terms, but it's an invasion of Eastern Congo. I mean, it sounds like a very aggressive term, but that's what it is. And that isn't actually allowed under international law, as we know. I think also having a regional process means that everybody is sort of forced to deal with their own responsibilities and their consequences. And sorry, it goes to that question as well about the refugees, because I forgot to answer that one. There are refugees all over. I mean, Burundi has lots of Rwandan refugees. Tanzania has lots of Burundian refugees. Uganda has lots of Congolese refugees and Sudanese refugees. Because there's been conflict in that region for so long. And then the refugee communities themselves become like vectors of conflict, right? I mean, look at why Rwanda got involved in the first place in Eastern DRC. It was to break up those refugee camps. So the refugees are both victims, are victims, obviously, of the conflict. And then later on, those communities sometimes are also triggers of new violence. I mean, the Red Tabara, that rebel group that Burundi's pursuing in Eastern Congo, many people say, I mean, it was around before, but that it was able to thrive in in Burundian refugee camps on Rwandan soil, and that the Rwandan government encouraged that. Whether that's true is a different question, but there are elements of that we do know are there. So, there are many reasons, in my view, to take this on from a regional perspective and not just focus on the DRC always being the real problem.
So in fact, Stephanie's written a paper for us that looks at that very theme, and I'm going to ask my colleague Laura to please just look on the website and post the link. Stephanie, it was about a year ago, I think, that you wrote that paper.
I think maybe you're gonna.
Okay, so we only have 15 minutes left on the clock, so we're going to do a rapid fire round. Stephanie, can you say more about the new DRC government and how that may affect the progress with the Luanda process in a negative or positive way?
Sure. I mean, it's hard to say because a lot of the people are new faces, but the new foreign minister is somebody who's she's a young woman, which is already a great start, I think. But also somebody who has a lot of experience working with the international community through the UN. So if I'm not mistaken, she was with MONUSCO, and I met her when she was working with the UN Special Envoy's Office to the Great Lakes. So this is somebody who has a lot of experience in multilateral settings, has seen how negotiations happen, knows what role the international community can play, what role regional communities can play, and so has, I think, a very good background to go into this kind of a space and try and find solutions to try and move things forward, both in Luanda and also in discussions with other international actors. So I think that's a really positive thing. I don't know that there are really, well, I would say that Daniel Mukoko Samba, who's the new Minister of Finance, is somebody who also is incredibly well respected and is an economist, and has been vice prime minister of that portfolio in previous governments. He's a technocrat, and I think that's also a good sign, because obviously the economy is always an issue, and relations with the World Bank and the IMF are always very important. So you have to have the right interlocutors there who know the space and know how to handle that. So those are some very positive developments, I would say, in terms of the international interaction.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. This is from Vonani M. Thank you, Stephanie, for an insightful analysis of the DRC conflict. You mentioned that the AU has been politically inactive. What is your assessment of Angola's mediation as the designated AU mediator? Considering Angola's proximity to the DRC, how can one understand Angola not contributing troops in Sami DRC?
Well, I think you've answered your own question in a way, because Angola, if it wants to be the mediator in the political dialogue between Kagame and Tshisekedi, cannot also have troops in Sami DRC. It's a conflict of interest, I would argue, and I think that Rwanda would argue that too. I mean, because that would essentially mean that on the ground, Angolan troops would be fighting against Rwandan troops in the eastern DRC, while at the same time the president of Angola tries to mediate. I think that really wouldn't work. I think Angola is extremely well placed. I mean, they have a very good diplomacy, and over the last, I'd say 10 years, they've become really important actors in the multilateral space. They certainly have the confidence of a lot of international actors who are wanting to support them. So I think that's useful. Angola also, and this hasn't happened yet, but Angola has committed to sending troops to the east to guard the cantonment bases. So if and when the M23 ever do disarm, the Angolan government will send troops to stand watch over them and protect them while the process carries on. So that is where Angola has made a commitment.
Okay, then there's a comment from Steve who says the funding of most local armed groups in DRC comes mainly from predation, mines, looting of civilians, illegal taxation. You've made these points. Also bringing up smuggling coffee and cocoa, especially in Ituri. So not a question, so we'll move on. There's also an evaluation link, please, if everybody would fill that in, just so that we can know what we're doing right and what we should do differently. Okay, then Esther Stefanelli says, thank you, Stephanie. 1, could you tell us more about Uganda's role in the crisis, its relations with the DRC and also Burundi? And then on Kenya, 2, is Ruto prioritizing relations with Rwanda? Question.
Okay, so Uganda's role is always an interesting one. I mean, I've said now several times that the close relationship between Uganda and DRC was something that Kigali didn't appreciate. Uganda is very worried about the ADF. And so its priority at the moment is to keep the Operation Shuja going, and to really try and eliminate that group. That's the sense I'm getting from the Ugandan government, which means it has to maintain a decent functional relationship with the Kinshasa government. Having said that, And while in past M23 upsurges and CNDP upsurges, Uganda has played a much, much more visibly supportive role of that group. It's not playing such a supportive role this time. And that's sort of been confirmed by people on the ground and people with access to drones and that kind of stuff who say we've never seen a battalion of Ugandans kind of roaming around North Kivu, whereas we've seen battalions of Rwandan army roaming around North Kivu. Having said that, there is a sense that because the M23 has used Ugandan territory to access Eastern DRC on numerous occasions, at the very least, there's a tacit agreement not to stand in their way and to facilitate that. And so they are playing some kind of a role there. And it's obviously very complicated because, if we know that, then, surely the Congolese know that as well. There's also, questions about this tacit support. Does it go all the way up to Museveni, or is this something that falls more under his son Muhoozi, who we know is likely to be the successor candidate to Museveni, and who has a very close relationship with Paul Kagame. He's considered a loose cannon, but was nonetheless recently made the head of the army. And so, again, if we know this, then so does Museveni. And so Museveni has, we all know, or we all suspect that Muhoozi is the one who's kind of facilitating this coexistence with the Rwandans and the M23, and then Muhoozi is made head of the army. So you can draw your own conclusions from that on exactly where Uganda is. But it is in a difficult spot in that it still wants to have a good relationship with Kinshasa over the Operation Shuja. But at the same time, and it's interesting because Uganda doesn't get quite as much flack as Rwanda does. And I have to say that the dynamics are very different, especially in this particular conflict. But Uganda is still selling smuggled Congolese gold. So there, it's a very complicated relationship, and I think that Uganda and Rwanda, or certainly Uganda has become more distrustful of Rwanda over the last few years since they had that kind of icy period where Uganda accused Kagame of trying to infiltrate his security services to eliminate Rwandan dissidents on Ugandan soil. And Museveni felt really undermined by that. So that's never really fully recovered. So they do regard each other with greater distrust. I wouldn't say necessarily that Ruto is prioritizing Rwanda. I think that if you look at the market size and kind of potential economic opportunity, what's possible in Congo probably does eclipse what's possible in Rwanda. So from a long-term economic calculation point of view, and you're Kenya, then you don't want to burn your bridges entirely with Kinshasa. But Ruto has been very clear from the beginning that he's not an ally of Tshisekedi's in the way that Uhuru Kenyatta was. And he's been quite clear about that. And also quite clear about, supporting Rwanda and some of the views about the M23. He said most recently, Congolese problem, which is tantamount to saying we don't believe in the Rwandan support. And so politically, Kinshasa can't count on Ruto. I think that's become pretty obvious. And that, at least not now, although there are still efforts on the economic front.
Okay, I'm going to close the questions now, so I'll take the ones that I have. Joshua Walker. Do you think the current diplomatic approach by the DRC and the tone that it uses when discussing Rwanda is effective? If not, how should it be changed? And then there's one more question after that.
Good question, because this is very much a war of narratives and war of winning and so forth. The aggressive tone, on the one hand, it works very well with a domestic constituency. And I think Tshisekedi has been somewhat successful with it because even though we don't have sanctions on Rwanda, we do have almost every Western country, including France, speaking critically about the M23 and the Rwandan support to it. And that is, I would say, a victory in terms of how the narrative is. We don't have to sit here and say the alleged Rwandan support to the M23. I think we've moved beyond that, and that's important. I think the problem for Kinshasa is possibly a bit bigger than just the narrative, and it has to do with sort of performance issues. Kigali is considered to be a reliable actor, a reliable partner. It sends its army to UN peacekeeping missions. It bails out Mozambique. It helps the French in areas where the French have economic interests in Mozambique. It's made itself useful to a number of big, important international players. And on the other hand, you have the Congo, which tends to disappoint on a lot of fronts. I think that even with how Tshisekedi has handled, the election, how he's handled the aftermath of the election, how, frankly, the state of the Congolese army, the brief alliance with the FDLR. I mean, these are all things that completely undermine the Congo, even though it has, in my view, I think quite clearly the moral high ground in the sense that, the M20 or the Rwandan and the M23, their arguments for being there, and of course Rwanda says it's not there, just are incredibly threadbare when you compare it to the reality of loss of life in Eastern Congo. So you should, I think, from a narrative perspective, we shouldn't even be going around and around on this. And I don't think a lot of credence is really given to the Congolese, the argument by the genocide of Congolese Tutsi, because it's simply, no one's ever been able to find, it just isn't happening. So I think that's where Congo has a bigger problem about how it performs in the international space, and what that means for how far certain countries are willing to put their head on the line. There's obviously also, the legacy of the genocide, which should never be minimized. How far that has taken support, and whatever you think of what the RPF is today, that still plays a big role. And there's just this complete unwillingness to criticize Rwanda on even the most obvious thing, and for them to be held accountable and feel the consequences. So narratively, they've won some victories. I don't think it's a brilliant idea to be as aggressive, but on the other hand, that's one of the things we know about the Tshisekedi government. They're not always strategically the greatest, unfortunately.
Okay, the last question comes from Toke Arnoldi again, and it says, the Nairobi process seems to be in a coma, may not wake up. Do you see any other countries stepping in instead of Kenya to facilitate a similar process between DRC and the armed groups? And then I'm going to ask you one question. How do you get your knowledge? Where do you get your information from? Because the depth and the breadth that you've displayed today, as you always do, Stephanie, is astounding. So how do you keep up with all of this? And is there anybody that's going to step in to Kenya's shoes in trying to get the DRC and the armed groups together?
Yeah, thanks. I don't think the fact that Kenya is Kenya's still there, but I think it's the process that's a step that's not necessary at the moment. It's not so much that there's nobody leading it as much as that those who need to participate in it don't want to participate in it. So you don't have any participants, which is defeats the purpose. I just think it's not the moment to be having that to be having the Nairobi process. Even if, maybe obviously if groups wanted to participate, you should go ahead with it. But the fundamental discussion point there was the modalities of DDR in the Eastern DRC. Right now, we have an M23 that's just gained 70% more territory than it held at the end of 2023. I think that talking about DDR is to deny the reality on the ground, and therefore it's not terribly useful. Obviously, it's unfortunate for the groups in the further north who do want to be having that conversation. And again, it's one of the reasons that we can't just dilly-dally and wait 1,000 years to fix this and find a solution. So to your question, Steve, it's been a long time. I've been working on the DRC since 1998, which definitely ages me. And I guess because I'm passionate about it, I follow it very closely. I have a lot of great colleagues in Congo, outside of Congo, with whom I interact often, diplomats, all those of us who have taken a shining to the Great Lakes and to the region. We all work together and try to exchange information and come up with useful insights and recommendations. So it's a bigger community, and it does, obviously the internet makes it a lot easier, WhatsApp groups and so on and so forth. But and I know know how you feel, because whenever I try to get up to speed on another conflict that I don't know as well as I know the Great Lakes, I realize, gosh, it's a tall order. But yeah, it's just been many years.
I'm not sure whether they've actually gone through with it, but at one point I believe that DRC was wanting to join the African peer review mechanism, which is something that I've been working on for 20 years, but that would make an interesting report indeed. Stephanie,
Yes.
thank you so much for giving your time and your knowledge and your insight. Thanks to the audience for really terrific questions. If you look in the chat, Laura has posted the link to that paper that Stephanie did for us about a year ago, and also a smaller piece about South Africa and the DRC that she wrote. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us on a Friday. I hope those that have not been able to join will watch this on our YouTube channel. So thank you very, very much, and have a lovely weekend, everybody. And maybe this time next week, we may have a government in South Africa. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, everybody.
Steve, have a good weekend.